$20 billion buys you 4 years of loyalty. $200 billion buys you the roads, the ports, the power grid, and the next 50 years of economic dependency. The United States just made the first bet. China made the second one 2 decades ago. And in March 2026, at a golf resort in Florida, the math of hemispheric control became impossible to ignore. Donald Trump hosted what he called the Shield of America's Summit at Mar-a-Lago on March 6, 2026. 15 Latin American leaders flew in, handshakes, photo opportunities, declarations of partnership, and for one country, a check, $20 billion paid to Argentina, not as aid, as a bailout, a currency stabilization loan announced days before Argentina's midterm elections. The recipient was President Javier Milei, Trump's closest ally in the region, and the man who has rebuilt Argentina's foreign policy around one principle: alignment with Washington. Milei won those elections decisively. His party swept the vote, and Trump declared the outcome a validation of his approach to the hemisphere. American leadership restored, the Monroe Doctrine revived. Dominance in the Western Hemisphere, as Trump put it, will never be questioned again. That statement came 1 month after US forces captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro in January 2026 and brought him to the United States to face drug trafficking charges. It was the most dramatic assertion of American power in Latin America since the invasion of Panama in 1989, and it sent a message that every government in the region received clearly: align with Washington or face consequences. But here is the part the Mar-a-Lago summit did not mention, the part that makes the $20 billion bailout look less like strategic investment and more like a rounding error in a competition the United States is losing by orders of magnitude. While Trump was writing checks to Argentina, China was operating the largest deepwater port in South America, not building it, operating it. The Chancay Port in Peru, 60 kilometers north of Lima, opened in late 2025 after years of Chinese investment. It is the first Chinese-controlled deepwater port on South America's Pacific coast. It can handle the largest container ships in the world. It cuts shipping time from South America to Asia by 10 days, and it gives China direct logistical access to a continent that the United States has considered its backyard for 200 years. Chancay is not an outlier, it is a data point. One port in a network of infrastructure projects that China has been building across Latin America for 20 years, while the United States was distracted by wars in the Middle East, financial crises at home, and the assumption that geography and history would keep the hemisphere aligned with Washington by default. That assumption was wrong, and the evidence is in the trade numbers. In 2001, only one country in Latin America did more trade with China than with the United States. Cuba, that was it. Everyone else traded primarily with the United States. 20 years later, the map has flipped. Every country in South America, except Paraguay and Colombia, now trades more with China than with the United States. Not marginally more, significantly more. Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Peru, Uruguay, Bolivia, Venezuela, Ecuador, Guyana, Suriname, all of them have reoriented their economic relationships toward Beijing. And they did it not because of ideology or political alignment. They did it because China offered something the United States did not: investment without conditions, infrastructure without lectures, loans without demands for democratic reform or human rights compliance. The scale of that investment is what makes Trump's $20 billion Argentina bailout look like a gesture rather than a strategy. Between 2005 and 2025, China invested over $200 billion in Latin American infrastructure, energy, mining, and telecommunications projects. $200 billion. That is 10 times what Trump just gave Argentina, and it was not distributed as emergency loans to stabilize currencies. It was deployed as long-term capital to build the physical systems that countries depend on to function: ports, roads, power plants, 5G networks, satellites, dams. China built Ecuador's largest hydroelectric dam. It financed Argentina's nuclear power plants before Trump's bailout. It constructed Peru's Chancay Port. It owns or operates significant stakes in ports in Brazil, Panama, and Chile. It provides the telecommunications infrastructure that powers mobile networks in over a dozen countries. It launched satellites that provide internet and communication services across the continent. And it did all of this through a financing model that does not require the recipient country to implement austerity measures, privatize state industries, or submit to oversight by the International Monetary Fund. This is not charity, this is strategic positioning. And the strategic value is not just economic, it is geopolitical. Because when a country depends on Chinese-built infrastructure to generate electricity, move goods and communicate digitally, that country's foreign policy options become constrained in ways that are subtle but durable. You do not vote against China at the United Nations when China holds the debt on your power grid. You do not support Taiwan's independence when Chinese companies control your largest export terminal. You do not align too closely with Washington when Beijing can make a phone call that disrupts your supply chains. The United States used to understand this. It used to be the country that built the Panama Canal, financed the Inter-American Development Bank, and provided the security and economic framework that made hemispheric integration possible. But that was decades ago. The last major US infrastructure initiative in Latin America was Plan Colombia in the early 2000s, and that was a counter-narcotics and military assistance program, not an economic development strategy. Since then, US engagement with the region has been defined by three things: immigration enforcement, drug war funding, and lecturing governments about democracy and corruption. Meanwhile, China was writing checks, big checks, no lectures, no conditions about labour standards or environmental regulations or press freedom, just capital and construction crews. And the result is that when Latin American leaders look north, they see a partner that wants to control their borders and criticise their governance. When they look west across the Pacific, they see a partner that wants to build their ports and buy their soybeans. The choice for many of them is not difficult. Trump's response to this shift has been to resurrect the Monroe Doctrine under a new name. His November 2025 National Security Strategy dedicated its first chapter not to Europe or China or the Indo-Pacific, but to the Americas. The document explicitly frames the Western Hemisphere as the United States' exclusive zone of influence and declares that restoring American primacy in the region is the administration's top geopolitical priority. The Venezuela operation in January 2026 was the enforcement mechanism for that doctrine. Maduro was captured. His vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, assumed power and immediately began cooperating with Washington. She allowed American oil companies access to Venezuelan reserves. She cut petroleum supplies to Cuba. She did what Trump wanted under the implicit threat that if she did not, the consequences would continue. That is the Venezuela model, coercive regime change followed by compliant governance. And Trump is now applying it across the region through a combination of financial incentives for allies and punitive measures for resistors. Argentina gets $20 billion in a presidential visit. Countries that refuse to cooperate face tariffs. Trump imposed a 50% tariff on Indian goods in early 2026, the highest in the world, partly as punishment for India's continued purchase of Russian oil. He threatened 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada, the United States' two largest trading partners, before negotiating sector-specific agreements. He told Spain he would cut off all trade after Spain refused to allow the US to use its military bases for strikes on Iran. This is foreign policy as transaction, rewards for compliance, punishment for independence, and in the short term it works. Javier Milei aligned with Washington and got $20 billion. His political coalition won the midterms. Other leaders are watching. El Salvador, Guatemala, Ecuador, and Paraguay have all signed bilateral trade frameworks with the United States. Honduras elected a conservative president with Trump's public endorsement after Trump pardoned the country's former president from a 45-year narco-trafficking sentence. Panama accepted 300 deported migrants after Trump threatened to retake the Panama Canal. But compliance bought with threats and bailouts is not the same thing as alliance built on shared interests. It is a protection racket, and protection rackets work only as long as the protector is the strongest actor in the room and the protected believe there is no alternative. In Latin America in 2026, there is an alternative, and it has been building roads and ports for 20 years. The Chancay Port is the physical manifestation of that alternative. It is not just a port, it is a logistical gateway that reorients South America's trade flows away from the Atlantic and the United States and toward the Pacific and Asia. Before Chancay, shipping goods from Peru or Chile or Brazil to China required routing through the Panama Canal or around South America's southern tip, adding time and cost. Chancay cuts that route by days and billions of dollars in shipping fees. It makes South American exports more competitive in Asian markets, and it makes South American economies more integrated with China and less dependent on US markets. The Pentagon knows this. US Southern Command has identified Chancay as a strategic concern not because it is a commercial port, but because dual-use infrastructure is never purely commercial. A port that can handle the largest container ships in the world can also handle military vessels. A port controlled by a Chinese state-owned enterprise can be used to support Chinese naval operations in the Pacific if Beijing decides it needs a South American logistics hub. The United States spent decades ensuring it had military access to ports across Latin America through base agreements and security partnerships. China is now building ports it owns outright. And Chancay is not alone. China operates or has significant stakes in at least 15 ports across Latin America and the Caribbean. In Brazil, Chinese companies control terminals in Santos and Rio de Janeiro. In Panama, a Chinese company manages ports on both ends of the canal. In Chile, China has invested in ports that handle the country's copper exports, which are critical to China's manufacturing and technology sectors. These are not symbolic investments. They are control points in global supply chains. The same logic applies to telecommunications. China's Huawei has built significant portions of the 5G infrastructure in Brazil, Chile, Argentina and Mexico, despite US warnings that Huawei equipment poses security risks. The United States offered no alternative. It told countries not to use Huawei but did not provide financing or technology to replace it. China did. And now when data from millions of phones and internet connections in Latin America passes through network infrastructure, a significant portion of that infrastructure is built and maintained by Chinese companies. The Belt and Road Initiative, China's global infrastructure program, is the framework that organizes all of this. Officially, the BRI is about connectivity and development. Unofficially, it is about creating dependencies that translate into geopolitical leverage. And it works because it offers something real. Countries get ports and roads and power plants they could not finance on their own. China gets access to resources, markets, and strategic positioning. The deals are structured as loans, not grants, which means countries owe China money, but the terms are often more favorable than what Western financial institutions offer, and the projects get built, which is more than can be said for many development plans that stall in bureaucracy and conditionality. The problem for the United States is that it abandoned this kind of economic statecraft. After World War II, the Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe. The United States financed infrastructure across Asia and Latin America to counter Soviet influence. It built alliances not just through military pacts but through economic integration. But that approach required sustained investment and a willingness to accept that other countries would use American money to build their own industries, which might eventually compete with American companies. By the 1980s and 1990s, that model was replaced by market fundamentalism, the Washington Consensus, privatization, deregulation, free trade. The assumption was that open markets would automatically benefit everyone and that countries would align with the United States out of shared economic interest. China studied that model and rejected it. Beijing kept state control over strategic industries, subsidized its exporters, and used state-owned banks to finance projects that private investors would never touch because the returns were too long-term or too uncertain. The result is that China can offer infrastructure deals that look economically irrational in the short term but make strategic sense over decades, and Latin American governments facing immediate infrastructure deficits and limited access to affordable capital take the deals. Trump's approach tries to counter this with a mix of coercion and selective generosity. The $20 billion Argentina bailout is the generosity. The tariffs and threats are the coercion. But this is not a strategy that scales. The United States cannot bail out every country in the region. It does not have the fiscal capacity or political will. The US federal budget is constrained by domestic priorities and debt. Congress authorizes foreign aid in billions, not hundreds of billions. And even when money is appropriated, it often comes with conditions that make it difficult to spend quickly or effectively. China does not face those constraints. Chinese state-owned banks operate with government backing and can extend loans on terms that would bankrupt private lenders. Chinese construction companies are willing to work in environments where Western firms demand higher margins and lower risk. And China's political system does not require legislative approval for every infrastructure deal in a foreign country. Decisions get made and implemented faster. The asymmetry is structural. The United States is trying to compete in a game where China wrote different rules and has been playing longer. And the scoreboard shows it. In 2001, total US trade with Latin America was roughly 3 times larger than China's trade with the region. By 2020, China had closed that gap. In some years, China's trade with Latin America exceeded US trade, and the trend is not reversing. Trump's summit at Mar-a-Lago was supposed to change that trend. The Shield of America's branding was meant to evoke collective security and shared prosperity. The $20 billion Argentina deal was meant to show that the United States can still write big checks when it wants to. But the summit also revealed the limits of the approach. Only 15 leaders attended. Several major countries sent lower-level delegations or skipped entirely. Brazil, the largest economy in the region, was present but not enthusiastic. President Lula has maintained a pragmatic relationship with both the United States and China and has made clear that Brazil will not choose sides in a new Cold War. That hedging strategy is the norm, not the exception. Most Latin American countries do not want to choose between Washington and Beijing. They want to trade with China, receive investment from China, and maintain security relationships with the United States. They want access to both markets, both sources of capital, both geopolitical poles. The problem is that Trump's approach increasingly forces a choice: align with us or face tariffs, use our technology or get cut off from our markets, support our positions at the UN or lose access to our financial system. China's approach is different. Beijing does not demand exclusive alignment. It does not require countries to cut ties with Washington. It just asks them not to actively oppose Chinese interests. And for most governments, that is an easier ask, especially when Chinese money comes without lectures about corruption or democracy, and when Chinese infrastructure projects employ local workers and get completed on schedule. This is not to say China's model is without problems. Chinese loans have left some countries with debt burdens they struggle to repay. Infrastructure projects sometimes benefit Chinese companies more than local economies. Environmental and labour standards are often lower than what Western projects require, and there is growing awareness in some capitals that economic dependence on China creates vulnerabilities, especially if Beijing decides to use that leverage coercively. But those concerns are long-term. The bridges and ports are immediate, and when a government needs to show voters that it is delivering development, a Chinese-built highway matters more than abstract warnings about debt traps. The United States has tools it is not using. It has the private sector capital, technological expertise, and institutional experience to compete with China on infrastructure if it chose to make that a priority. But it has not. The US International Development Finance Corporation has a lending cap of $60 billion. That is less than a third of what China invested in Latin America in a single decade. The proposed America's Partnership Initiative, meant to counter Chinese influence, was announced but never funded at the levels needed to be competitive. The Build Back Better World and Partnership for Global Infrastructure programs were rebranded versions of the same concept, announced with fanfare, underfunded in practice. The gap between rhetoric and resources is the problem. Trump can host summits and give speeches about American leadership. He can hand Argentina $20 billion and call it a strategic victory, but China is spending 10 times that amount across the continent and doing it every year. The math does not work. The United States is trying to win an infrastructure competition with one-time bailouts, while China is building a permanent logistics network. And the competition is not just in Latin America, it is global. China is the largest trading partner for over 120 countries. The United States is the largest partner for fewer than 6. The gap widens every year, and it widens because China made infrastructure diplomacy a core component of its foreign policy, while the United States treated it as an afterthought. The irony is that the United States invented this playbook: the Marshall Plan, the Interstate Highway System, the Tennessee Valley Authority. These were massive state-led infrastructure projects that created economic growth and geopolitical leverage. But that was 80 years ago. Since then, American political culture has moved away from state-led development and toward market-driven solutions, which works well for many things but does not work for competing with a rival power that uses state resources strategically and plays a long game. Trump's transactional approach might secure short-term wins. Milei stays loyal. A few countries sign trade deals. Migration flows get managed, but these are tactical victories, not strategic shifts. The strategic shift happened when China built Chancay Port, when it financed energy grids across the continent, when it became the primary trade partner for most of South America. Those are facts that $20 billion to Argentina does not change. The $20 billion is a band-aid on a structural problem, and the problem is that the United States is trying to maintain hemispheric influence without investing in the infrastructure that sustains it. You cannot dominate a region you are not willing to build, and you cannot counter a rival that is laying fiber optic cables, pouring concrete, and signing 30-year contracts while you are giving speeches about sovereignty and sanctions. The future of Latin America will not be determined at Mar-a-Lago summits. It will be determined by who builds the roads, who finances the ports, who controls the telecommunications networks, who provides the capital that governments need to deliver for their citizens. Right now, that is China. And unless the United States is willing to compete at the same scale, with the same patience, and with the same willingness to invest in someone else's infrastructure, the hemisphere will continue drifting toward Beijing, not because of ideology, because of infrastructure. And infrastructure, unlike loyalty, cannot be bought in 4-year increments.